week, I started a video discussing the Chief of Defense Staff directive requiring all members of the Canadian Armed Forces to receive COVID-19 vaccinations. And in that episode, I focused on religious exemptions and what's involved in a religious belief according to law. On today's episode, I'm going to get more into the nuts and bolts of what's in the Queen's regulations and orders about the administrative release process and what steps you can take to try to protect your rights. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So in this second part of a two-part video about the Chief of Defense Staff's directive to members of the Canadian Armed Forces to take COVID-19 vaccinations, I want to take a look at the Queen's regulations and orders with respect to administrative release. And specifically, my understanding is that what they're planning on doing to people is what's called a 5F release, which is released because you're no longer capable of carrying on your duties as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. So let's look quickly at Chapter 15 of Volume 1 of the Queen's Regulations and Orders. It talks about release, and there's a couple procedural things that I think are important to highlight here. So I've got Chapter 15, Release, opened here. I'm just going to skip ahead to 15.36, Notice of Intent to Recommend Release for Non-Commissioned Members. It's almost identical wording for commissioned members and officer cadets, but I'm just going to do the non-commissioned members because the majority of members of Canadian Armed Forces are non-commissioned members, therefore I suspect the majority of people interested in this video are non-commissioned members. So section 15.36 outlines what's required when a commanding officer proposes to recommend release of a non-commissioned member. Under subsection 2, they have to personally deliver that notice directly to a non-commissioned member, and this is what I believe is important. Subsection C, require the non-commissioned member, if he objects to the recommendation, to reply to the commanding officer within 14 days stating why he objects. And the same procedure is followed if someone higher up, all the way up to the Chief of Defense Staff, is the one who's recommending release, because they are required to forward that notice to the commanding officer and direct him to take action in accordance with paragraphs 2 sub B and C, which I just went through. So either way, it's going to be the commanding officer giving the notice, and it's the commanding officer who an objection is filed to. Now, I believe subparagraph 7 is the reason why an objection to the recommendation to release should be taken, because it says if a non-commissioned member to whom a notice of intent to recommend release has been delivered in accordance with the article does not reply in writing to the commanding officer within 14 days, the non-commissioned member shall be deemed to have no objection to his proposed release. So, in my view, you have to at minimum make that objection so that that argument can't be used later that you never responded, therefore you obviously have no objection to this. I think it could hurt you in any court case or in the grievance process if you are inclined to grieve. Now, what might an objection to a recommendation for release look like? As far as I can see, the QRNOs don't lay out a specific format for an objection. What seems to me the appropriate course would be to file a standard military format letter in the approved format. I think form is as important as substance in this, because you want to show that you know what you're talking about, you know what you're doing, you're not just some idiot troop who they can easily drum out of the service without consequence or without pushback. And I think that a properly crafted letter adhering to the approved format is going to help you achieve that. So you start, of course, with your return address at the top, and then you want to put the appropriate file number. So what I've used here is file number 5705. That's the code for releases. There's a number of other codes you could use that seemed appropriate. Put the date, of course. Address it to your commanding officer. This is actually a mistake here. I need to delete that. Then you put a subject line identifying what this is all about, objection to recommendation for release. Then you have your references here, and I highly recommend you use references. Cite the letter that's telling you of your intent for release. I've just used a kind of a random one here. You put where it was served to you on, the file number, who wrote it, being the CO, and the date. I put reference the QRNOs that we're using here. Reference some DAODs, such as the workplace accommodation one, to back up what you're saying about why this is wrong, what's being done to you. There's a number of others you could use as just one example. And reference any telephone conversations that you had leading up to the recommendation for release. Then we get into the body of the letter. So I'm not going to give detailed description of things you could put in there. Every letter is going to be different, and I'm not a huge fan of using templates. I think you need something tailored to your situation, but it should start with an introductory paragraph that describes why you're writing the letter. So this one says this letter is to give a written reply to the notice of intent to recommend release of 30 November 2021 in accordance with the Queen's Regulations and Orders, Volume 1, Chapter 15.36, subparagraph 2, sub C. And I object to the recommendation for the following reasons. So after you've put your introductory paragraph, you then simply describe the reasons that you object to the recommendation for release, whatever they may be. Do subparagraphs where you can cite documents or give further exemplification of the reasons that you give. So in other words, back up everything that you're saying. Then finally, you end with a concluding paragraph, as I say here. This may depend a bit on your relationship with your CO. Perhaps put something conciliatory, pointing out your years of good service, or similar, indicating your hope, trust that your objections will result in positive consideration. Indicate your signature block. And then there's a section for annexes at the bottom. I recommend attaching documents that you refer to your letter. For example, I have the QRNOs 15.36 here. Not every commanding officer is going to be well versed in the QRNOs, so I would give them a PDF or a printed version of the sections you're referring to, and I'll put a link in the show description where you can find those. You may even want to consider a copy of the Supreme Court decision Amsalem that I referenced in last week's episode. And again, anything that supports what you're saying, I would not assume that your CO has it or has access to it. Don't just give them links. I would give them the actual document. What happens if your objection is rejected? Then we get into the grievance process. Chapter 7 of the QRNOs lays out the process for submitting a grievance. So it says here at 7.08, a grievance shall be in writing, be signed by the griever, and be submitted to the griever's commanding officer. And it lays out what's to be included. So a brief description of the decision that's being grieved, a request for the determination and the redress sought, which most likely the redress sought would be to not be released for declining a medical treatment. If a person can substantiate the grievance, a statement in writing from that person, and a copy of any relevant document in the possession of the griever. And a grievance shall not contain language or comments that are insubordinate. So, in other words, be polite. Now, it should be noted that as Section 7.25 indicates, Section 29.15 of the National Defense Act provides that a decision of a final authority in the grievance process is final and binding, and, except for judicial review under the Federal Courts Act, is not subject to appeal or to review by any court. Now, some have taken that to mean that you can't be involved in any court challenges if you filed a grievance. It's not entirely clear to me that that's the case, given the wording, except for judicial review under the Federal Courts Act. So I think there is still ability for judicial review. There's still ability to challenge the CDS directive in its entirety, because I believe that a charter challenge at the federal court will take the form of attacking the CDS directive, or perhaps attacking the directive from the Minister of National Defense to the CDS. Whereas what the QRNOs and National Defense Act are talking about, the final decision of grievances, that's final on your grievance, but that's separate from attacking the directive in and of itself. I highly recommend that if you're experiencing this situation, if you're a member of the Canadian Armed Forces at risk of losing your career because you've declined a medical treatment, contact a lawyer. You can call another lawyer, or you can call myself. I know I've been saying for almost 2 months now that I'm not taking new clients, but I am prepared to make an exception for members of the Canadian Armed Forces to try to assist them through this in any way I can, and I will give a reduced rate to those members to reflect the fact that I don't have the wealth of experience in this area that I do in civilian criminal law. If there's any show topics you'd like to see me cover, please send an email to the address listed below or leave a comment in the comment section. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing. And remember, if you're watching on YouTube, we're also on Odyssey and Rumble.